Hello again, year nine. So I've been having trouble putting together one large video for this because it's so much content in it. So if you are having trouble with the content of this question, which we're going to have a look at, compare the causes and consequences of recent urban trends in ACs, EDCs, and LIDCs, you can skip ahead to the question structure video. This video I'm going to try go through quite in a decent amount of detail, the content of what you need to know about the urbanization of those different types of countries that we're going to look at. So I'm going to go through it using some images, a kind of a concept mind map here. And I'm going to start off in advanced countries. Okay, so over here in advanced countries, we're starting off around recent times in the 1950s. In cities like London, which you could refer to in your answer very briefly, there were these problems such as overpopulation, pollution from factories, and just generally not being able to get enough services that people wanted to because there were so many people living in the city. This causes the first trend of urbanization that we're going to look at, this popular movement called suburbanization. Okay, I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to put down suburbanization here so you have that to write down. And I'm going to come to this later on as well. Okay, so what is suburbanization? It's actually these people get tired of living in the city centre. They still have a job here maybe, so they want to move close to the area. They end up commuting from the suburbs. So they move to the suburbs where land is cheaper to live in, to buy. They have the same services that they would have had in the city, but maybe they have better access to them because not as many queues, not as many people living in the area. So they still got shopping centres. They might have shops locally, smaller shops. They're going to have hospital and other healthcare services like a GP, got schools, residential areas to live in, amenities like parks, recreational facilities, and they've got really good transport connections like railways, roads, bus routes to the city and back to the suburbs from the city when they're commuting back from work. Okay, so they feel like they have more space, and what we call this is the cause of suburbanization is the overcrowding and the pollution, and then the consequence of suburbanization is what we call depopulation from the city centre, or urban sprawl, the spread of the city outwards. Okay, that's the consequence of this trend. Again, the question asks us to have a look at causes and consequences. Okay, now we're going to move on to the 1960s and the 1970s. A new trend starts to happen. So because of the suburban sprawl and also the depopulation of the city centre, we get this problem is that there's just not as much of a reason to stay in the city anymore. So people think they're going to start and look for a better place to live, a place with more space, even more so than the suburbs. They end up, because of this depopulation, moving to the countryside. So this is my countryside here. Okay, very few homes, very few residential areas, not too many roads, and they feel like it's a better place to raise a family. They think it's quiet. They think there's less crime than there is in the city centre. And what happens because of this trend called counter-urbanization, which is this movement from city centre to rural areas, is that the city goes into urban decline. The buildings become abandoned, go into disrepair, which is when you might see them boarded up, or that the walls might look really, really bad from the outside. They might look like they're in disrepair, and the factories are abandoned, nobody working in them, so they too fall into this disrepair, and the consequence again is this urban decline. Okay, and then as a result of the urban decline, people start to think we need to reinvest in these cities. So from the 1980s onwards, we've had a reinvestment in the advanced country urban areas. Okay, so this has been happening and it's still happening, is that because of urban decline, they started to get their thinking hats on in terms of being able to improve the city, improve workspaces for these people here, improve tourist attractions for these people coming to visit the area from abroad and from within the UK or other cities, whatever city it is, because this is generally about all cities that are advanced country cities, and other other attractions, and construction was of a much better quality, and the consequence of this idea, the consequence of this re-urbanization trend is regeneration of the city center. Okay, so the trend is re-urbanization, and the consequence is the regeneration of the city center for that. Okay, so again, I didn't go back to my sheet here, but over here we had counter-urbanization. And over here, re-urbanization. Okay, so those are the three trends for advanced countries. And again, we had the dates for those. Please take them down in your notes if you need to. They need to be mentioned. So we're now going to kind of block that and come over to this area here of low income and developing countries. Okay, and emerging and developing countries, and what's the difference? So emerging and developing countries and low income and developing countries, they did not experience the recent they only really recently experienced this urbanization. The reason why is that the advanced countries, they experienced urbanization longer further back in the past because of industrial revolution. Okay, and the reason why they had the Industrial Revolution so early on in the 1800s is because they didn't get colonized. They were the colonizers, these advanced countries. The colonizees, the people who got taken over, they had their development slowed. So just a quick history lesson here is the colonization process was from the 15th century onward, when advanced countries, our today advanced countries, back then they went over in their ships and they took slaves and they stole resources from these LIDCs and EDCs. Okay, countries like Nigeria, Brazil. Okay, so they slowed the progress. I've written here. They've slowed the development of these countries, and they did not go through the Industrial Revolution until more recently, and they did not go through urbanization until the 1900s onwards. But now, from the 1900s onwards, they start to experience this. Because of the new urbanization that they're starting to experience for the first time, people living in rural areas feel like they don't want to stay there anymore. Why would they not want to stay in a rural area in an LIDC or an EDC? Because they have bad access to drinking water in their rural area. They have poor living conditions. They have poor access to jobs like farming with dry land mostly. And they have very few services like being able to buy things in shops. There would be very few shops, if any. So what happens? These newly developing cities down here actually say, well, we're up and coming. We have jobs. We have comfort. Why don't you come and work in these cities? But the problem is it's not all good like that. What happens when they arrive in the city is that they actually might not get a job, or the pay is lower than they think. And if the pay is lower than they think, they end up living in slums. Okay, over here, slum-like conditions are problematic for people in many ways. There is poor urban planning, so we get this pile up of buildings. If you imagine that this is on a hill, okay, you've got poor drinking water. It's polluted with waste that people from these buildings are throwing out their windows. People are not very, health conscious, and it gets really overcrowded. Okay, really overcrowded, and people end up resorting to crime and things like that. So those are the differences between urbanization in advanced countries and urbanization in emerging and developing and low income and developing countries.